smoothly there with the sound. You're live.
Am I good? Am I live? Excellent. Take two. Welcome to season 6, episode 2 of Inside the Rookery. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Paco, a role player of over 30 years experience. And I had all this written down the first time, and it was so good when I read it out the first time. So smooth. Now it's all gone. A publisher and artist who has been running the GMS magazine podcast blog and YT channel for over a decade. We are really happy to have you here. Welcome to the stream, Paco.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much, Andy, for having me. Seriously, I know this has been coming for a very long time, but we've managed at last to do it, and I am super, super excited. So thank you very much indeed.
No problem at all. Before we bring up the first question, which as always, we've had questions pre-submitted from our Patreon community on Discord. And as always, if you've got comments, pop them up and I will bring them up on screen, or maybe Andy Law will this time, because I am having severe technical issues, as you may be able to tell from the strange way we went live. We've had some incidents in Rookery Towers this week with our technical setup, including a dead laptop and a secondary laptop that is not playing ball. So I'm on a third or fourth backup option, and I may be a little bit choppy. If so, I'll just shut up and let Andy Law talk, which I'm pretty good at doing usually.
I do like to talk. Oh.
Before we start with those pre-submitted questions, so I just wanted to have a chat, each of us really, about why we're passionate about diversity and inclusion, and particularly in this industry that we're in. I'll let you go first, Paco.
Thank you. Okay, well, firstly, because I am a gay man who grew up in the south of Spain, which is especially 30, 40 years ago, I'm 50 now, it was an incredibly homophobic environment. And in particular, role-playing games were a very good way to explore in a safe-ish way what it would be like to be gay. And most importantly, and this is something that we don't often talk about, what would people around me would say about queer characters. Because coming out, especially when you're in that kind of environment, it can be very risky. It's very, very tough. So knowing what people think about that, knowing how people would react if you told them that you're interested in them or that you wanted to see in them, it is very, very important. So that gave me that opportunity. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it mattered an awful lot. And later on, when social media came along and I started to meet people, I started to get to understand a lot more that I wasn't alone, that people really found important to see themselves, to be able to experiment, to experience, even if it is from the safe distance of performing a character in a game, what it is like, and to see themselves in that game. And for me, that matters because role-playing games literally saved my life when I was a young teenager. And I want this hobby to be the best it possibly can be. And the only way to be the best it can possibly be is to make sure that it is diverse, that it is inclusive, and that it is safe for as many people as possible. So that's why I am very, very passionate about it.
Thank you. For me, when I left university and started my career in banking, which was my day job, I always worked in really male-dominated teams. So quite often I would be the only woman in the room. I would be the only one on the call. I would be the only woman on a weekend away doing data center migrations, moving servers and doing cabling and stuff like that. And it felt really lonely because when you're the only person of some kind in a room, you're expected not just to be yourself, you're also expected to be like the archetype of that person and fulfill every role that kind of person is expected to. But because that's the expectation of you, you don't get rewarded for it. And for a woman in the workplace, that could be really crappy. You're expected to be the conscience for the team. You're expected to be the mum, the big sister for the team, to remember the birthdays, to help, do all of those things on top of the same job that everyone else is being expected to. And so all through my life, I've been a role player since I was tiny. When I've played games and I have GMs who've put constraints and given excuses like, well, that's just the way the world is, it's really riled me up, because I was facing barriers every day, and at work I was working with the gender network, eventually leading the gender network, getting promotions, not being the only woman in the room, getting a promotion, being the only woman in the room again, and having to start again with a whole new team, fighting for partners to get equal leave so everyone can choose whether they want to go and look after their children or their parents if they get ill. And so I've been like a passionate crusader in that world, and it made sense for me when I started working and writing and editing in TTRPGs to bring that experience and to really challenge some of the mindsets I saw, which we'll talk about some of those examples later, that really were just mindsets that needed to be overcome or given a different perspective to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm white, straight, male, in my middle ages. You're going to expect me to be pretty much on the outside of much of this conversation, and it would be very easy to cast myself as that. I grew up very much in the position of privilege, and around me, I was fortunate when I grew up to be surrounded by a diverse community, because I lived in what may have looked like the most remote community in the north of Scotland, but we had an American community for an American base so that they could spy on Russians up there. We also had a nuclear power station which dragged all of the best minds from across the country up there. So I grew up surrounded by folks of all different stripes, colors, creeds, religions, sexual backgrounds. It was a fascinating place to grow up, but I had no awareness that it was that. And coming down to Edinburgh blew me away. Because Edinburgh was seen as Scotland's most diverse city, and it was as white as you could see, from edge to edge whiteness, with a single mosque standing somewhere and a couple of people wandering through going, yep, I'm definitely not white. But it was really strange coming down here. But again, I was in a position of privilege and I kind of forgot about it. And it wasn't really until I had kids that it really sunk in. And I remember the day in particular made me start not just thinking about it. I'd always thought about it. I'd always been aware of it, but I hadn't really thought about it. It was the day when I was speaking to my eldest daughter, Josie. She was wanting to collect Warhammer. And we had pulled out all the different armies and we'd put them all out in front of us and we'd gone, which one do you like? And she looked through them all and she found it an exceedingly difficult process, because there wasn't a single thing there that really spoke to her or spoke about her experiences or spoke about the things that she liked in the world. Now, I'm not talking about rainbows and unicorns and all the rest, because immediately you go, well, she's going to go, hi, wood elves, isn't she? She did, by the way. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about things that she enjoyed. There was a lack of interesting female characters that weren't just men in skirts. There was a lack of everything, really, that she was interested in. And that wasn't because those things weren't Warhammer. It's because the war game had forgotten what it was. If you actually read the background, the High Elves were described in depth as not really having the same sexual dimorphisms that we do as humans. They were really represented as being a society where gender no longer mattered in many respects. They had equal rights across the board. Every single last freaking model was male. All of them. And nobody realized. And by the gods did we start challenging that. But I was already thinking about those things because I'd already started to collapse the standard gender roles that many of my friends considered to be acceptable, because I was a stay-at-home dad. To give you an idea of how ridiculous that was, a newspaper approached me to do an article about being a man who had decided to stay at home, because that clearly was crazy. And I did that article and I told them that it wasn't, but I told them the day-to-day stereotyping that I faced, the number of women who refused to see me as being capable as a carer, the number of men who looked at me and said, well, you're not a man, are you? You can't be a man. You're not doing things right. And it's those impositions of stereotypes upon me, who was in a position of pure privilege, that made me start looking outwards and realizing just how bad it was for other people. And in a way that I wouldn't have done if I hadn't started facing it myself or having to deal with it on my children's behalf. And from that point onwards, I flipped completely. I became a completely different person. I looked at the world in a completely different way. And I hope that all of my work from that point forward would be, let's say, a little bit more open, more inclusive, much more diverse in my approach to how characters work, because people are not, or they very rarely are, stereotypes.
Yeah, we could tell some funny stories about the comments I used to get at work about Andy being the stay-at-home dad, but we will not. We'll save that for an in-depth discussion between me and Andy. So Kilishandra asks, and I think this is a key question when we talk about inclusivity, diversity. What is the difference between inclusion and diversity, and why are they important?
Okay, I mean, the difference to me is quite clear. Let's, however, to make sure that there is no room for interpretation, let's go for the definitions. So, according to the dictionary, inclusivity is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those with physical or mental disabilities or whatever. Whereas diversity is the state of being diverse, variety, the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc., etc. So there are things that do overlap with diversity and inclusivity. And what overlaps is the presence of people. However, with inclusivity, what you're doing is you're actually making a conscious effort to include, to make people participate. What do I mean with this? It really isn't inclusive if you have a large number of people from different ethnicities, different countries, different cultures, but they have no say if they don't see themselves reflected in your product. That is inclusivity. If you don't ask for their opinions and take them into account. You can have a very diverse number of illustrations in a book, but if you're not including those traits from their cultures, their countries, their personalities, their needs, then that is not being inclusive. So that is the thing. It's the inclusivity is the intention, is the effort that you make to make people feel and be included in whatever it is you're doing.
And quite a lot of the questions are about being a GM and being inclusive at your table. But I'm going to come to the questions first that are more about, because we are creators, that are more about creating the diversity and the challenges of creating. And then, but we will try and get to those player GM questions, because I think they're important too. But just before we jump into the creators, I just wanted to illustrate the point, bring up this one from Zigo. It says, I'm in an online game with a Dutch, Swede, Italian, Irish, and 2 US players. Is this enough of inclusivity, or do I have to have each player as a minority in their home region to be inclusive? No, of course not. Paco.
No, I mean, look, you don't have to do it. It's no needed. The important thing is, if somebody approached you, will you be willing to make some allowances to make that person welcome and included in your group? Lindsay, you made a very good point earlier on. Let's say that somebody from a religious background who's got a particular day of the week where they cannot play for whatever reason, tell, I want to play with you. And you say, yes, okay, we only play on Saturdays. And it's a bit, but that is exactly the day that you cannot. Can you play on Fridays? No. If you cannot make it, then you're out. That is not a good approach. That is not a good attitude. So you don't have to go out there and look for people. But if people come to you, what are you prepared to do to make sure that those people are included, that their voice matters as much as anybody else's? Look, I'm right now playing on Thursdays with another 3-4 cis guys. 2 of us are queer, the rest are straight, and I am not going out there. I'm not going to say to any of my friends, hey, I'm sorry, mate, but you don't have a space because I must have a woman or I must have a black person. I'm not going to do that because those are my friends. Those are the people who came here. Those are the people that I'm playing. But if one of them left and somebody from India decided, hey, Paco, can I join your group? But, I cannot make it on this time, or when we have dinner, can you please not have this food? I would say, absolutely, yeah, no problem whatsoever. Come along, you're welcome here. That is the trick. The trick is not to force a situation that nobody is asking you to fulfill. That's not the point.
Yeah, we're not, and no one's saying that games, especially not your own personal games, should have quotas that you need to fill. Like, that's absolutely not what this is about. But as a creator, creating content, writing interesting characters, getting artists to draw them, it wouldn't be great if every single character I wrote about had looked like me, acted like me. It would be boring, for one thing. But
Absolutely.
that's, yeah. Let's just.
I'll add a small little bit there about, so
Please
with inclusivity, it's all about doing what you can to ensure that as many people as possible can be included, but also it's about ensuring that the group you have all feels that they have been included. So, for example, if you've got yourself a group that's comprised entirely of cishet white dudes like me, and then a woman comes along and joins the group, that is not just a matter of saying, of course you can join in, it will be fine. It's making sure that the playing environment that you have is inclusive, welcoming, and entirely open to being adjusted to accommodate what you might find are somewhat unexpected needs, because they find certain things uncomfortable that you and your previous players found completely comfortable, because that was where you'd established your social guidelines already. When you're bringing new people in, you need to ensure that you have conversations early about exactly what makes it the safest environment for everybody that's involved. Oh, there's one.
Yeah, so Smiling Tom says, when developing RPGs, what is better for inclusivity? Include as a diverse cast as possible, or just limit the descriptions to just significant traits needed for the story?
Oh my God, this is a very good one. Okay, do include a diverse cast, because the problem is that we as human beings, we tend to fall into what we know, and what we know very often are cliches and stereotypes. If you don't include any description, we're just going to go for what we know. And what do we know? Human, white, cis, straight, and that's it. So it just doesn't help at all. So no, by all means, do become inclusive, be as diverse as you possibly can and want to and are able to find out about fearlessly. Just be inclusive, get options and be inclusive, but limiting the descriptions, I don't think that helps anyone, not the GMs, not the players, no one at all. I don't think that's a good idea. I'm sorry.
So I have some pretty strong opinions on this one in particular, particularly because the stories that we tell are generally human stories, regardless of what our individual backgrounds might be. They're the stories of our experiences, and our experiences will all be diverse, different, and often very strange. The second you start limiting descriptions and saying that people are blank, what you're doing is you are divesting, as a creator, all of that creativity and all that potential story that could be told to just a single individual, the GM, and what they're aware of in the world. You won't be able to tell those broader stories. As a single example, to make it as clear as possible, if I was going to be writing about a big city that was diverse, and I didn't mention that diversity anywhere, then I have not created a city that is diverse at all. I have pretended that I have. And this is something that became a point of contention in a variety of projects where I've been on, where you would send out a piece of work, you'd give it an explanation as to what it should include. For example, this is a great diverse city. It's full of people from across the world. And everything that came back was white and male. And they didn't realize they were doing it because they were writing their own experiences. And that's one of the reasons why we as creators, when we are writing about diverse subjects, have to do our very best to ensure that we employ people that come from many diverse backgrounds, because then you get different voices explaining different experiences, providing NPCs that you yourself would never have considered because it's outside your experience. And that just adds so much extra depth and granularity to your setting. Why would I want to limit myself to just my own personal voice? My own personal voice, as far as I'm concerned, is obviously awesome, but it is just mine. And there are a million other super awesome voices out there. And that is something that I think in this particular case, I would strongly recommend against, because what you're doing then is actually limiting stories, not promoting creativity. It's far better to try and challenge people and make them go, well, how can I think outside the box and outside my own experiences, rather than saying just reproduce them.
I do have to, I'm not sure if Seago is being cheeky, but it really isn't about the table of your friends and diversity. It's not about saying I'm Lindsay and I'm a bisexual woman and so I need to have these kind of people around my table. That's not at all what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, as creators and as GMs, the worlds we create shouldn't just be reflections of ourselves. Because especially as creators, so many people out there will be playing our games, and it would be great for all different kinds of people to be able to see themselves in those games. Just as when Andy was starting to talk about Warhammer with Josie, she couldn't see anything that spoke to her in the game. And it's good to have things that speak to you, because for so many of us, role-playing has been like a really important part of our lives to deal with our neurodiversity, our mental health, our physical limitations. And because of that, it's a safe space where you can explore things. And it should be a safe space for everybody to explore things, not just the tiny group of people that look like the creators of a game. Right. Lore Master of Sotek has got, and this is something that has come up. How do you navigate fulfilling some of the players' desires for sex-positive experiences while also watching out for those who find such content vulgar or even exploitative? And Seagoat's actually asked a similar question, so I'll bring that up too. How do you approach taboo subjects of sex, intercourse, and relationships in games?
Okay, I think the easiest way is with 2 words: session 0. That's it. Talk, communicate, find out, talk to people, find out what is the scope for sexual intercourse or sexual development within your characters in the game, and make sure that those boundaries are set from the get-go. That is pretty much it, really. I don't think it needs any further than that, unless you're playing with children, in which case, hello, let's not push those boundaries. But if you're playing with adults, talk to them. People are happy to do that. If somebody else joins, just have a quick session 0 with them and let them know how things are going and what's been done. But I think most of these issues is just a matter of communication, not necessarily of the topic in itself, but to know where do people need you to stop and how can they communicate to you that the topic has gone far enough. What is going to be, talking about being sex positive, what's going to be the stop word? At what point, and how are you going to find out and realize, and how are people going to feel safe enough to tell you, hey, that was too much for me, we need to stop now. That's it. But it's a matter of communication.
I used to be on a committee for Edinburgh City Council as a parent member, and I remember walking down the steps of the beautiful City of Edinburgh Council chambers, chatting to one of the councillors, a Green councillor, with the convener behind us. So like some quite, the education committee lead, the education secretary for Edinburgh, essentially. And he was saying to me, "What are you doing now?" I said, "I'm off to my burlesque class." We chatted about burlesque. I was like, burlesque, the British tradition of burlesque is really about sending up people in power. You know, it's not what you imagine as American burlesque, which is all like tassels and nipples and teeth. You know, it's very much like a social and cultural comment on, and so we were doing things about Brexit, about Theresa May, about like lots of different routines. But he thought that I was completely out of order talking to him about burlesque with his colleagues and important people who'd been elected around him. Whereas I just like, I had never even considered that I shouldn't talk about burlesque. It's just you know, it's just like a cabaret activity. And so people's cultural viewpoints and can be really, really different. And that's why the session zero is important. But it's why it's also important to understand the people who are in your games. Like, violence seems to be completely cool in a role-playing game, but the minute you introduce sex, especially for certain cultures, that is more problematic. And so that's why I think the importance of discussion.
Yeah, so I'll add a little extra on top of that. Before we did the big Lawhammer streams and we were streaming out weekly with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and going through the Anyway Within, we sat down with all of the players and we did our session zero equivalent, which in our case was drafting up an A4 document with a big long list of things that we were comfortable with, might not be comfortable with, or were totally uncomfortable. No, it's never happening. And we went through each one of them and discussed them. But before we did that, we pretty much passed it around as an anonymous questionnaire. And it was only the points that each of us either highlighted as potentially being problematic or definitely being problematic that we brought up. And it was enormously useful. Now, it may have sounded like something that most games don't need, and most games may not. If you're playing with the same group of players, with your old friends from ages ago, you already know the boundaries that you're all happy with. These sort of session zeros don't provide any utility. But this one did, for two reasons. One, we were going to be streaming publicly. Suddenly, everybody's boundaries change when you're doing something in front of other people. And that meant that some of the players who perhaps had professional jobs, then they might not want certain things to be brought up, had to bring that up and say, you know, I can't have this sort of material mentioned. And that immediately changed everybody's perspectives. We all went, oh, yeah, that's a good point. We don't want to do that, which was good. But also we had some new players and they brought a whole host of new boundaries that some people didn't expect, and that was also really good because we discussed it and we talked it all out. We understood where everybody sat, and then by the end of it we had a big long almost laugh about some of the daftness of the things that we weren't going to be covering, some of the ones we definitely were, and just how crazy those lines appear if you look at them in exclusion. Because in exclusion, sex and violence, really seriously, they're both topics that, I mean, they should flip. Sex should be fine and violence should be awful, because that's really what it's like in real life. But it's interesting, it's the other way around. And much like that, many of the things that we decided that we wouldn't portray in the stream were ones that we all thought individually we probably would have been okay with, but not for a stream. It was a fascinating thing.
Yeah, and Seago, that's what I was just sort of alluding to, that violence we seem to be so inured. We don't even think about we don't even think about describing violence in the same way as we would think about describing sex. But definitely, we not really to chat about role-playing with children here, but that's definitely a topic for another stream that brings its own challenges, because you want to introduce things at appropriate ages. Seagoat says, I agree with Paco. You need to agree with players a session zero do's or don'ts before the game begins. And in a way, Seagoat, that actually answers one of your questions in terms of, apart from not being... Sorry, my system is really, really slow. Can someone read out this comment for me?
Apart from not being a complete dick as a GM, do enjoy stressing that point. How do I be more inclusive? Do I just say yes to everyone and let them walk over me as a GM for the sake of inclusivity? And the answer is no. You talk all out what your individual game is and the way you play. Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing I find very interesting about this question is this notion that being inclusive means letting people walk all over you. And that is one thing that I don't really understand where it comes from, in the sense of nobody walks all over you when you're saying respect my culture, respect my heritage, my background, respect me, my sexuality, my gender. Nobody walks over you when they are doing that. If anything, they're actually reacting at that feeling of being walked over or simply becoming invisible or being othered. So I don't understand why let them walk over me as a GM for the sake of inclusivity. I just don't understand how that could even be possible.
I think it's the same way as you wouldn't let someone walk all over you if you were. I always use whatever I'm talking about. Use the analogy of a pub, like Facebook. People being a dick to me on Facebook. Would you do that in a pub? Would you just come up to me in a pub and overhear my conversation and be like, "Hey, I disagree with it. Hot take. You're so wrong." No, you wouldn't do it in a pub. If you wouldn't do it in a pub, then you don't do it on Facebook. And if you wouldn't do it in a pub, you don't do it at the gaming table. So, like, we're humans. We're social creatures. We are used to managing boundaries. Sorry, Andy, you wanted to come in.
I have completely forgotten what I was going to say. I was going to say something. Inclusive. If it comes back to me, I'll bring it back up.
But if someone is pushing boundaries and kind of being a dick and making out that it's something to do with, you know, inclusivity, then they're saying something else and you're not hearing what they're saying, and it's about how they feel their safety, or that person is kind of just taking the piss, and you're going to have to take a decision which one it is at your table.
Right. So I've got the one, and it's one I've seen many, many times, and it is a problem that many people are blind to. The number of times that I have seen Lindsay go off with a group of boys, for example, at work, and I use the word boy over the men because of the very nature of how they acted. They were boys. And similar situation where the expectation was anyone going with them, if they were in the majority, would act like one of the boys.
Yeah.
So they expected everyone to respect them and their boundaries. And their boundaries were often really weird. In that there was things that they thought was super cool because that was what the boys did. But anything that lay outside of that wasn't cool. And in a similar fashion, large groups of any people have this sort of level of expectation that you conform to their way of thinking. And that is not inclusive. That is exclusive by definition. And generally speaking, my preference is to always be as inclusive as possible. If we have somebody who's along who is culturally different, who is just different in any way, really, you want to do your best to make sure that they don't feel like they're other, that they are different, that they are standing separate to you, all having fun. You want to be including everyone having fun. It's pretty much as easy as that, really. One of the boys.
I'm really interested to hear your view on this, Paco. So Kilishandra asks, terrible takes on my culture, gender and sexuality are the norm in TTRPGs, and I frequently feel on the outside looking in. What would help alleviate that?
This is a very tough one. Firstly, because Kilishandra, I know exactly how you feel, because being of Gypsy, Roma descent, I know what it is like to have your culture and your heritage being completely misrepresented so often, and very often on purpose. So believe me, I know what it is like. And unfortunately, there is not an easy answer. And the answer I have is unpleasant because it puts the onus on you. The only way to alleviate that is either to create content that will challenge what you have seen, to engage with the people who created the content and hopefully make them see what they're doing is not the right thing to do, and to promote a different environment. It is very difficult, but it's a bummer of our position that if we don't start the process of change, the oppressor is never going to change it, because that's, this is what we were talking about earlier, about going to what we know, going to what we are already familiar with. That is what they know. These people, I bet you that more often than not, they don't write these things out of maliciousness. It's not intentional that they want to make you feel bad, that they want to make your people look bad. It's not that. It's just that is all they know. So unless we take a proactive role and begin to talk, to engage, to promote, to create it's going to be very difficult to change. And that is really annoying because it means that we have to do the work when we are being the victims of those misrepresentations. But there really isn't an awful lot more than we can do to alleviate it. We need to do some work.
Yeah, and I'm going to come at it from a very similar angle. I'm going to say that the majority of the people who are creating material, particularly within the gaming and RPG space, are relatively left-wing to begin with. They're creative folks, and they are often generally people who want to do the best that they possibly can with a given piece of material. And many of them are fully aware that they might not be in the best place, and they will make attempts to try and make up for their deficiencies in particular areas. But if they create a thing and it's not good enough and nobody tells them, they won't change. They just won't, because they won't need to. Indeed, they won't. Not only will they not change, they'll clap themselves on the back and think they've done a good job because they thought about it. They tried. They made a really big effort. And to the majority of their audience, they probably did do well because they might have been opening their eyes to a culture that they themselves weren't aware of, and they will promote that material as a positive material, as something that actually does good. And unless people come out and say, actually, no, the thing you've done is the same thing that's been done again and again and again, and this is why, things won't change. So as much as it's a horrible thing to say, and it might make people tired, you've got to speak. You've got to say hello in whichever safe environment that you can do so.
I felt such a whiner when we were working on Wifrit 4th edition, didn't I? Like, because I would constantly be saying to Andy, like, the careers went away. I wrote a couple of the careers chapters, but other people wrote them, and then I did a second pass on them. And I think, Andy, you'd asked for, like, broadly the quotations for the careers to be like 50-50 split, male and female, where it was obvious who the person was. And they came back like 10% female, and that speaks to, like, our as a culture, how our particular culture, how we feel about the visibility of women. We feel it's about 50-50 when they're like 10%, right? And so I had to say to Andy, I'm just going to swap these ones. And I would just literally swap names and turn them into female names. And I actually felt like I was doing something wrong. And it's a really hard, like, feeling to describe, but I can only describe it as, like, my literal unconscious bias about the space women take up, even my own space, like, coming out of me. Mm-hmm. And we had a really interesting thing happen in our role-playing session last night, where Andy narrated a flashback and someone was a woman in the flashback. And the other players at the table assumed that the woman in the flashback was the wife of the man in the flashback, whereas to me, she was clearly like a professional spiritual advisor. Now, Andy didn't say what she was, but the assumption, and that's just like our natural biases coming out. So I think you have to be, like, aware of yourself and kind of, like, ask yourself, is there other people I should be talking to? Are there people that I need to read this? Or how, like, if I'm feeling a bit weird about this, like, why?
Yes, they definitely can help. Sensitivity readers definitely can help.
So I'll bring up an unexpected piece of GM advice, just to go a slightly different tone while speaking to exactly the same things. People are full of unconscious biases. They are full of things that they think are the case, and often they are completely unaware of the fact that they're biased. A classic example, I'm going to go on the most obvious example that you can use as a GM, is to confuse people as to who individual NPCs are by playing upon these biases by, for example, you hear of a doctor doing some things. Oh, it's terrible and awful. That doctor's been killing people. Pretty much everyone immediately goes, man. Every single time. Even if you just say doctor, that doctor's been really helpful. That doctor's been helping out doing this. Man. Because the unconscious bias is that doctors are men. This is obviously a cultural thing. It's not the same across the board, but it is for almost every group I've ever been in. The expected outcome, and you can use that as a tool, because then you can introduce said character later as a woman, as something else, and they immediately don't think that those two things are related, so that when they are found out to be related, not only do they go, oh, I didn't realize that, there is also that subtle behind the scene thing where they start judging their own prejudices. And that is something that roleplay is really good at. putting you in the shoes of someone else, or looking at the things that you yourself expect to be true and finding that they're not quite right, and then examining your own prejudices and also the prejudices of your character, because you might be playing a character that is prejudiced, and that in itself can bring a different aspect, as long as you're doing it well and you've got your boundaries set up. So yes, unconscious biases play directly into these things.
Definitely.
We covered this one slightly, but I just want to come back to it. From Smiling Tome, most of the time the ID, sex, sexual orientation, or perceived race of NPCs are irrelevant to the story. Should they be omitted, leaving it for the GM to adapt? No. I mean, if it's the world that you're creating and you want that world to reflect something, then you should put them in. Otherwise, you're just leaving every GM to just decide what the world is. But the crucial thing is that even if you do give them a sex or a sexual orientation, the GM can still change it.
And also, I'm going to say something very controversial in here, okay? So please don't hate me too much for saying this. But if the ID sex, the sexual orientation, or the perceived race of the NPCs are irrelevant to the story, your story is weak. Sorry, it cannot possibly be that NPCs, what they are, how they are, where they come from, is irrelevant to the story. Then you don't have an NPC, you have a lamppost. That's it, an ornament. An NPC, from my point of view, it should be something interactive, something that helps develop the story. Of course, not every goblin is going to be an NPC that needs to develop the story. That's not the point. But every person in that village should be. So fleshing them up will make your story a lot better. If you don't do anything at all like that, it's like making a salad with ice cubes. No, sorry, no.
Salad with ice cubes. I like that one. So one of the biggest complaints that I have received as both a creator, as a GM or whatever, just discussing role-playing stuff in general, is when they get themselves a pre-printed adventure or they get themselves a pre-printed setting and they respond with something like, oh, but the characters, they were bland, they were empty, they didn't have enough bite, there was something missing, there was something that didn't quite do it for me. So I ended up having to rewrite it, and that was, as far as I was concerned, a waste of my time. And when settings came out with the opposite, where they have gone into some depth, often depth that is considered to be irrelevant to the primary plot line, they're the characters that everyone goes, oh yeah, that character was fucking awesome, it did this, it did that, it presented me with something that I'd never really considered as a GM, damn straight I was going to be using that. The blander we make our NPCs, or the NPCs that only fit storylines, so the only detail we provide is the bit that is important for that story, the less interesting it will be both to read as a GM, because some of them will feel like cardboard cutouts that are wheeled on and then wheeled back off again because they're no longer relevant. But they'll also be much less useful for you as a GM on the long term. Who are these people? Can I use them again? Can I bring them back as a recurring NPC at a later point? Well, who are these people? And that's when the GMs are often going, well, I like this NPC, but there's very little to do with it, so I had to build more. So my general question, my response to this one would be, it isn't hard to bring a really in-depth, colorful character to life with a relatively small number of words. And you can cover all aspects of their culture that are both relevant to the story and potentially not just the story, but relevant to the story of the setting. And that always talks about culture and the tensions you get between different peoples. And if you have all of these tensions removed from your NPCs, your setting just becomes a vanilla ice cream. I like vanilla ice cream, but I also like to taste other ice creams too.
And I think maybe Andy, you had a couple of comments from like fans or whatever around certain characters who were in same-sex marriages in Warhammer, along the lines of, well, yeah, like I get that they might be, but why did you have to write her wife in the book? Right. And to me, that really smacks of, they're like, that really smacks of like, don't ask, don't tell bullshit. Like, why wouldn't you write her wife in the book? You'd write his wife, you'd write her husband. So why shouldn't we have characters of every sexual orientation in the books that we create? Like, why would we not?
Exactly.
So I don't want to wax lyrical about this because it's not really the space, but broadly speaking, I couldn't agree more. If anyone has any questions on it, feel free to ping me somewhere else as to exactly why. But the Warhammer world in particular is significantly less bothered by such things than the real world. After all, it doesn't have a giant church saying that world must be one way. It has loads of them. But I will end on one little thing that B. Sherry said to me. That was my assistant producer, because we were discussing how we were going to handle different NPCs at that point. And B, being B, came up to me and said, so, you know, what I really need is my NPCs need a justification to be heterosexual. Because he'd been confronted so many times, they've been confronted so many times, pardon me, by people saying they need to have a justification to be anything other than heterosexual. And he was like, nope, from this point onwards, every single character needs to have a reason for them to be heterosexual. If there's not a reason, they're not going to be. Because they were getting annoyed with getting pigeonholed characters that were just bland representations and being told that there's only certain ways that they can portray things.
But also, to the point that Paco, you were making right at the start, that in a nutshell is what the difference is between diversity and inclusion, right? So B worked for you. You had a diverse person, let's call them, in your team, but the way they were made to feel was that their sexuality was different. That's not an inclusive work. I mean, you had that discussion with them and resolved it. But if that had persisted and you'd said, no, absolutely not, that would have been a non-inclusive workplace. So that's what we mean when we talk about like the little barriers that you can face. Paco, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, I was reading Milling Tom. I completely lost the track. But absolutely, yes. I mean, there is no way to... As a gay man, there is no way to make somebody feel included unless, as I said, you include them, and include them requires effort and requires saying and asking and listening and proactively adapting whatever it is to be adapted for that person to be there. So yeah, diversity is good and proper. Inclusion is super cool.
Yeah, and Smiling Tom just clarifies, which is interesting, Smiling Tom. My question was going in the other direction. Normative relationships are set as canon for most characters in most adventures. Having this left open makes it easier to adapt to a more inclusive development when such things don't come defined. I agree, but maybe those creators just need to make normative relationships like less common. But I get what you're saying. But as a GM, you can always change it. If you don't like that you've got another heteronormative relationship between, you know, a cis man and a cis woman, then just change it.
Absolutely. But then why not the other way around? You know, why not having every single relationship in, you know, queer relationship and then make it normative if that's what you want? Why? That's the other thing. Why do I have to be making the effort all the time to change normative to, you know, queer?
Yeah. And indeed, that was at the heart of the conversations that B and I were having when we were discussing our NPCs, because we were looking, because we were doing a development pass at this point, and we were looking at the material that we had, and it was a mixture of older material and newer material, and you would not have known that some of it had come from the 80s, and some of it had come from what was then, the 2010s, because they were so deeply not just heteronormative but hetero white guy. The only people being discussed were white guys. Every NPC was a white guy. The women had been forgotten about. Anyone that might be non-standard was completely forgotten about. And B had come up to me and was at a state of going, why is it like this? And we had a big long discussion about it and how we were going to cope with the next steps and how we were going to cope with our development. And why is it like that? So I agree actually with Smiling Tom. A lot of them are like that. And one response would be, let's fix it by removing that. My alternative would be, let's fix it by fixing it and being much more diverse rather than less diverse and blancmange like white.
So Kilishandra asks, this is a tricky one. Good questions from Kilishandra. And actually on that, Seagoat put a note in the comments saying some of their questions are really the kind of questions they think people want to ask, but maybe are scared to because they're a bit controversial. And we appreciated that, Seagoat. We had a chat with Paco before the stream to make sure that he was comfortable with the questions. And we agreed that they're the kind of questions that all too often people are shouted down on and made to feel like they're a bad person for thinking it, when actually it's something that we just need to talk about because this kind of stuff's difficult. And on that note, Kilishandra asks, how do you engage with media that contain problematic elements or creators? Do you boycott? Do you engage with what you like, or something else?
Well, very carefully. I think the first thing to do is figure out whether that person, that creator, is like that. As in, if they are racist, if they are misogynists, if they are homophobic. Because if they are to their core, then it probably doesn't matter what you tell them. It's not really going to make that much of a difference. But if we are talking about the TTRPG industry, I would say just talk to people. Just say hi and tell them, from a point of constructivism, just tell them, look, I found this, and this to be incorrect, or this, and this is problematic. This, and this is how I would have done it. How about changing it? What is your take on this topic? And try to start a conversation. If that conversation goes south, then take other measures. Now, the only thing that I think it is very, very important to keep in mind is that it is very easy when you engage with media that their fandom is also going to engage. And I think it is very important to differentiate between fandom and the media. Because the fandom, they can be pretty vicious if they feel they're threatened by anything you say or criticize. And they're completely separate entities. Yes, it is true that the creators do have a responsibility to call out fandom's bad behavior, but at the end of the day, they cannot fully control it, so we have to be very careful. And if at the end of the day that doesn't work, and that person doubles down on their behavior, then yes, boycott, engage with people that are doing what you think should be done, promote smaller creators that you think are doing the correct work, create something yourself, vote with your wallet. That usually sends a very, very clear message. So, but above all, do it safely. Set your own boundaries as to how much you want to get into this. And if it gets too hot, take a different approach, but do not become victim of bullying or harassment because you're approaching somebody that is doing something problematic.
I'm going to add a small bit on this one as well, if that's all right. This is a very difficult area because you're often dealing with people's loves, the things that they have grown to really enjoy. And I'm going to go outside of TTRPG to go for one of the starkest and most obvious areas here, and that's JKR Rowling. I can't even get her name out today. And Harry Potter. Thank you. And Harry Potter, because that computer game was recently released, and that brought an incredible amount of heat because obviously there's some deep issues with her opinions on trans issues for a lot of people. And I obviously was not going to buy that game for a variety of reasons. And I didn't. But I saw a lot of people who did, who were good-meaning people, who absolutely adored the worlds that she created, and they were persecuted, massively persecuted, for having beliefs that were, as far as other people were concerned, damaging, but they didn't hold those beliefs. And then it turned into this tit-for-tat argument where they were left justifying a purchase for something that they loved. And it really hurt them in a way that perhaps was the point, because it would make them perhaps, not buy something in future, but it didn't do what everybody was wanting, which was to promote a good, positive environment to discuss these matters and try to exclude the horror that was on show for many. And it was difficult. I saw people literally arguing in spaces that I'm aware of about this and causing differences that made the the offending party, so to speak, clam up, no longer want to talk about it, no longer want to engage with the entire argument, and indeed think of the other people as really hardline weirdos. So they did disservice to what they were attempting to resolve. It was unfortunate.
It's a tricky one, because we could have a whole episode about that that kind of issues, because I can understand that. And I have some friends who are very, very hardcore Harry Potter fans, and I can't stand it for many reasons. But I'm not going to belittle them for that. I think the point is, as far as I'm concerned, the point is not whether you consume Harry Potter or not. It's whether you understand the problematic aspects of Harry Potter, and you are prepared to agree and admit that there are some very problematic issues with Harry Potter and its creator. So as long as you can do that, fair enough. But the moment that you start saying, no, there's nothing problematic here. Oh, no, I don't. Yeah, that's a bit shitty.
Yeah, it is. And
I had some friends. I had some friends, I didn't buy the game, but I had some friends who on their social media feed said, I would appreciate it if you wouldn't talk about the game on my feed. Like, and they didn't, or they would just like block them. I thought like that was quite extreme. Like, just mute them for a week or a month. I don't know, but they clearly felt so passionate about it that was what they felt they needed to do for their psychological safety, which is absolutely their right to do.
And that is the thing. One thing that we need to keep into account as well is that people usually don't react that extremely out of nothingness. People usually do that because they're tired, they're sick of it, they're being hurt and wounded so many times that it's a knee-jerk reaction that once you understand a little bit where they come from, it may be difficult to deal with, but it is understandable.
Yeah, absolutely is.
And I get what you were saying, Andy, that the way they engaged entrenched the views of the other person, but the onus is never on the minority to engage in a way that is polite and, it's like such a stereotype and such a demand upon people. Anyway,
fighting is a necessary component of it. I completely agree.
Exactly.
But
it's like the civil rights activists weren't. Everyone thinks they would have been a civil rights activist in America in the 50s and the 60s, but like, how many people actually would have risked their jobs and their houses and their families to do it? Like, heroes become heroes because they risk something, and I think sometimes we forget that, and we expect heroes to be heroes like right now. That's not why people become heroes.
No, definitely.
Yeah, they're often the ones who are demonized in the moment, and later on become the heroes. Exactly. Completely agree.
This is going to be our last question, but I thought it was a good one to end on. From Mark McGee, do you have any tips or advice about how best to maintain an inclusive experience at the table while exploring worlds that are themselves not necessarily as inclusive?
Okay, I have two ways of doing that. Firstly, I change the world. It's my game, it's my table. I take out whatever problematic components I don't want to see around my table, and that's the end of it. Or I can use those elements to punch up. The problem is when those elements are punching down. For example, let's say that, to talk about my my own experience, that you have a homophobic world. If you are going to, which is something, okay, I'm going to summarize this in with a response that I had to a historian when I was publishing games in Spain. Okay, and he said to me, "You're going to have it very difficult to publish a game where queer people are accepted in medieval times." Because they weren't, and it was horrible. And what I said to him was, okay, when are you going to start writing about how we survived those times? Because we did. We had lives, we had friends, we had relationships, we did manage to do all those things, but you never write about that. You only write about how we were beaten, killed, demonized, or otherwise tortured and put out of existence. When are you going to punch up and actually talk about how we survived? So take those issues that are problematic and punch up. So if your world is racist, why not make the characters face the choice of being racists or saving the people who are being oppressed? Why not putting their characters as heroes on the side of the weak, on the side of the victim instead of doing it on the side of the oppressor. How about changing that? And suddenly your world becomes a lot more interesting, and it becomes a very good learning opportunity for a lot of people. So that, personally, that is how I would see it. But above all, if whatever problematic element is there, you cannot see yourself changing to punch up or to make it a constructive experience, take it out. It's your game, your table. You don't owe the creator of the games anything around the table, and canon means nothing if it's hurting you, nothing at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a practical sense, maintaining really clear lines between in character and out of character actions and jokes and is really important when you're role playing in a world that's not necessarily as inclusive, because all too often, especially when we were younger, much younger, like teenagers starting to role play, you would see people working through their personal psychological problems at the table, but like in a really unhealthy way, and almost like taking it out on the other PCs, but not really doing it in character, and that becomes like a really unhealthy way to play. So session 0, have your lines, but also, you know, like if you're having a fight with another player, like don't just keep it in the game. Like you shouldn't need to say that, but sometimes I think, especially for people who are starting off in role playing, it's easy to forget that.
Definitely.
That.
So
Agreed.
I'm gonna with a comment from Bill Payne, because it makes me feel good about myself and our discussion. And that's important. Bill Payne says, discussing these issues is so important. Thank you. I wish we could keep going or return often. Thank you. Thanks, Bill. And thanks to everyone who contributed questions and comments. Made us think and have a really good discussion. But thank you most of all to you, Paco, for coming along. It's just you and I have met, although I know Andy and you have met before, so it was a real pleasure to get to know you and to get to know your views on a topic that's really a passion for me and clearly for you too.
Thank you. No, thank you very much indeed for having me. Truly, this has been amazing. I wish we had another 5 hours to talk about all these things. Before I leave, though, I would like just to leave with one small reflection, because I know for a fact that an awful lot of people are quite concerned about how to bring these topics to the table, so not to be offensive, not to be hurtful, not to be, you know, what you don't want to be. Don't be afraid to fuck up, as you should not be afraid when people tell you that you have done it. So if you want to write gay characters, if you want to write any kind of ethnic background, do write it. It's okay to get it wrong. But when somebody tells you, hey, you got this wrong, and do ask for opinions and do ask for the input of people who know more about those things than you, just take it in the chin. It's okay. We are not going to hurt you. We're not going to say that you're horrible. But if what you've written needs changing, just be prepared to do it. But you will not learn unless you make mistakes. Do make mistakes. Trust me. Just go ahead and make mistakes. Just be prepared to change your ways if you're challenged. So yeah, please just do that.
Again, that. Completely agreed.
Yeah.
I could
and
not
we've
agree.
got a lot of comments.
Great
Got a lot of comments coming in
Paco.
saying our viewers want you to come back, Paco. So we'll maybe have to do something another time, a more in-depth discussion with you, because we didn't talk about any of your. Usually we share links and we talk about the person's work who's on. So we'll need to do another session where we do full justice to you as a creator yourself.
Thank you. I will be absolutely delighted. So absolutely anytime, just let me know and I will make myself available whenever you want.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lovely.
Is there
we'll
anything else I need to
all
cover, Andy?
I was just going to say we'll have links to all of Paco's goodies down in the description over on YouTube in about 20 minutes, because we'll update it all afterwards.
Brilliant.
And by all means, do people keep the conversation coming. You know, approach me in Twitter, approach me in TikTok, in Facebook, whatever you want, and I'm here for you. So anytime.
Thank you so much. So thank you to all our patrons, as always, who make these streams possible. Thank you to Paco for being an amazing guest. Thank you to Andy for being a co-panelist with me today. And we will see you for another Inside the Rookery in just a short week. Until then, all that remains for me to say is good night and caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.
Oh, it's fast.
We're still live?